A powerful billionaire thought he could summon the woman who once loved him back into his life with a single invitation. But when Elena stepped onto that stage and sang, her voice shattered his carefully built world and exposed the truth he'd hidden for years. This isn't just a story about lost love. It's about pride, betrayal, and the haunting power of a song that refused to be silenced. Who is this woman who finally made him face everything he feared? Where are you watching from? Subscribe now so you don't miss the next unforgettable story. Julian Carter had always believed that the world bent itself to the will of men like him. At 36, he was the youngest CEO ever to helm Crestmont Enterprises, a multinational conglomerate that spanned luxury hotels, private banking, and media outlets. Even the skyline itself seemed to salute him, his glass tower puncturing the clouds like a monument to conquest. To the public, he was the epitome of precision and charisma, a man who could close a billion-dollar acquisition before breakfast and still have time to appear in the tabloids by lunch. But behind the polished image, there was a part of him he could never fully quarantine, no matter how many deals he inked or empires he devoured. That part had a name: Elena Rivera. It was Miles's 8th birthday, and the penthouse gleamed as if the party itself were a performance designed to announce Julian's power. Every inch was draped in silver and blue. The decor was understated but expensive in the way that only old money could manage. The guest list included venture capitalists, a few movie producers, and several politicians discreetly seeking campaign donations. Julian watched the staff bustle around with arrangements, making last-minute adjustments to the towering cake and the live string quartet warming up near the windows. He sipped his coffee in silence as the dawn light glinted off the marble countertops, 1,000 tiny reflections dancing over the immaculate surface. No detail escaped him, least of all the fact that none of these trappings could mask the emptiness that settled on him each year as the day approached. Miles's birthday had become an occasion Julian both dreaded and anticipated. It was the only day he allowed himself to remember everything he'd worked so ruthlessly to bury. The nights he'd spent with Elena in the cramped rehearsal studio, the first time he'd heard her voice wrap around a melody so tender it almost undid him. She had been the only person who never seemed impressed by his success. To her, he was just Julian, the man who sometimes forgot to eat dinner because he was too busy chasing something he couldn't name. When she left, it wasn't with a dramatic final argument or a slammed door. It was a letter, 3 pages long, folded carefully on his desk, the ink blurred in one corner as if she'd cried while writing it. He had never been able to bring himself to read past the first paragraph. This year, he thought, would be different. He was older, wiser, impervious. So why did her name still taste like regret whenever he dared to think it? As he finished his coffee, Julian walked into his study and opened the antique cabinet where he kept his most private files. There, hidden behind innocuous folders, was a single photo album wrapped in a soft blue cloth. He pulled it free and sat in the high-backed leather chair, the morning light growing bolder across the room as he turned each page. There they were, frozen in time, their arms around each other at a charity gala, their faces lit with a happiness he no longer recognized in himself. In one photo, Elena's dark hair tumbled over her shoulder as she laughed, her eyes closed in pure delight. Julian's throat tightened. How had he ever thought he could replace that with wealth or status? A knock interrupted his thoughts. Lauren, his executive assistant, stepped in with her tablet clutched against her chest. She was crisp and unflappable, a woman whose ambitions were as sharp as the stilettos she wore. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone polite but wary. She had learned long ago that Julian did not appreciate being caught in moments of sentimentality. "Just wanted to confirm the catering and the entertainment for this evening. And the guest list." He set the album aside, expression shuddered. "Have you sent the invitations?" "Yes, sir. Everyone you requested. The governor's office called to confirm their attendance, and the Thompson Foundation has accepted." She hesitated, glancing down at her screen. "I wasn't sure about this last name, though." She tapped the tablet and rotated it toward him. The name glared up at him. Elena Rivera. Julian's heart gave a quiet, traitorous thud. He had told himself it was only curiosity, a harmless curiosity to see whether she would even respond if he reached out. But in that instant, he realized he had been lying to himself. He wanted her to see how far he'd come without her. He wanted her to witness what she'd walked away from. And a darker part of him wanted to watch her falter when she had to stand in front of him again. "Send it," he said softly. Lauren's brows lifted. "Sir, are you sure? It might cause complications." He met her gaze, his own eyes flat and unyielding. "I'm very sure." "Understood." She turned crisply and left the room. He leaned back, pressing his thumb against his temple, as if he could rub out the ache behind his eyes. The last time he'd seen Elena, she'd been standing on the sidewalk in the rain, a suitcase at her feet. He had been too proud, too convinced she would return if he waited long enough. But the years had passed, and she never looked back. Part of him had admired that about her, even as he resented it. She was the only person he had ever loved who didn't need him. Hours later, as the sun rose fully and the catering team arrived to set up the banquet tables, Julian walked the perimeter of the penthouse, noting every flaw. A smudge on the glass railing, a hairline crack in a vase, the angle of a spotlight that seemed a fraction off. He corrected each imperfection, each detail, because he couldn't control the one thing that mattered most: how he would feel when Elena walked through the door. In the afternoon, he visited Miles's room. His son was sprawled on the carpet, building an elaborate racetrack with miniature cars. Miles looked up and grinned, his smile so wide it almost knocked the breath from Julian's chest. "Daddy, look, I made the loop like you showed me." Julian crouched beside him, smoothing a hand over his hair. "Very impressive." "Will Mommy be here tonight?" Miles asked. His voice was guileless, but Julian felt the question like a shard beneath his skin. "Your mother, she can't come," Julian said carefully. He hadn't seen Miles's mother in years either, another casualty of his life choices. He'd learned to live with that emptiness, but with Elena, it felt different. Like an unresolved chord still humming through his veins. "Will there be music?" Miles asked hopefully. "Like the last time?" Julian hesitated. "Yes, there will be music." After Miles returned to his game, Julian stood by the window, watching the city churn below him. He had never admitted this to anyone, not even to himself, but he was afraid of what tonight might cost him. He had built an empire from ambition and discipline, but there were some forces that refused to be commanded. Elena's voice was one of them. When Lauren returned with the finalized schedule, he scanned it without really seeing. In the back of his mind, he could already hear Elena singing. He imagined how the guests would fall silent, how her voice would pierce the facade he'd spent years perfecting. And in that moment, he almost called it off. Almost. But pride was stronger than caution. He signed the schedule and handed it back to Lauren. "Make sure the press stays discreet," he said, his tone as smooth as ever. "I don't want this to become a spectacle." Lauren gave a small, unreadable smile. "Of course, Mr. Carter." As the evening descended and the penthouse came alive with laughter and music, Julian felt the familiar armor of his public persona slide into place. He was the host, the mogul, the man everyone envied. But deep inside, he was still the 20-something who had watched Elena walk away in the rain. No amount of success had ever been enough to silence that memory. In the final moments before the guests arrived, Julian returned to his study one last time. He opened the blue cloth and traced the edge of the photo album with his thumb. For a heartbeat, he wondered if he should read her letter in full. But he closed it again, sealing the past back inside. He wasn't ready to confront what she had written. Not yet. Tonight would be his answer. Tonight, he would see whether time had made him immune to her, or whether all his achievements were nothing more than monuments to a loss he'd never truly accepted. And as the first guests began to arrive, their voices floating through the grand entryway, Julian Carter stood alone in the shadows of his own making, bracing himself for the one person who could still unravel him, with nothing more than a song. Elena Rivera was not surprised to find the heavy cream envelope waiting on her small kitchen table when she returned from teaching her last voice lesson of the evening. The moment she saw her name embossed in elegant script across the front, she knew exactly who it was from. She set her canvas tote down and removed her coat with deliberate calm, as though refusing to acknowledge how her pulse had begun to quicken. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, feeling the way old memories shifted beneath her ribs like a bruise she'd almost forgotten. It had been 8 years since she had left Julian Carter's world behind, a world of glittering penthouses and power lunches where everything and everyone had a price. She had built a quiet, careful life in the time since, one where she was known only as Ms. Rivera, the music teacher with the warm smile and the haunting voice. No one here cared about her past, and she had been grateful for that anonymity. But apparently, the past had decided it was time to find her again. She picked up the envelope and sat in a single armchair by the window, the city lights beyond her glass panes glittering like 1,000 distant stars. For a moment, she wondered what Julian had told himself when he ordered this invitation prepared. Did he believe she would come crawling back just because he summoned her? Or perhaps he thought she'd be too proud to show her face, and her absence would somehow prove he had been right to let her go. Either way, she had no illusions about the reason behind his invitation. Julian Carter never did anything without an agenda. Still, her fingers trembled a little as she broke the seal and unfolded the thick cardstock. The script was familiar, the same stylized font she had seen on dozens of invitations during the years she spent by Julian's side. "You are cordially invited to the 8th birthday celebration of Miles Carter," it began, but she barely registered the words. Her gaze fell to the bottom of the invitation, where a personal note had been scrawled in ink she recognized too well. "Just one song," it read, "for old time's sake." The audacity of it made her chest tighten. For old time's sake, as though their past had been some casual dalliance, a sweet memory he could summon like a pleasant melody whenever it suited him, as if it hadn't nearly destroyed her to walk away. But even as resentment flared in her veins, a quieter voice, one she had tried so hard to bury, whispered that maybe she owed herself this confrontation. Maybe she had been hiding too long, letting fear dictate the boundaries of her life. She folded the invitation again and set it on the table, exhaling slowly. She did not need Julian's approval. She did not need his money or his validation. But she did need to know that she could stand in front of him and sing without falling apart. The next morning, she woke before dawn, unable to shake the memory of his handwriting or the implication behind that single sentence. Just one song. As she dressed for her day, she reminded herself that she had rebuilt her identity piece by piece, that she had chosen this life because it was honest and hers alone. But the thought of facing him after so many years left her throat dry. When she arrived at the community center where she taught private lessons, she tried to immerse herself in her work. She coached a young soprano through scales, guided an elderly baritone through breathing exercises. But no matter how hard she focused, her mind kept returning to the invitation. By afternoon, she finally admitted that she would not find peace by pretending she hadn't received it. She texted her friend and fellow instructor, Clara, to ask if she could cover her Saturday morning lessons. When Clara asked why, Elena hesitated before replying, "Just something I need to do. Something overdue." She didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't press her. That was one of the things Elena valued most about her. She never asked questions Elena wasn't ready to answer. Later that evening, Elena returned to her small apartment and unlocked the cabinet where she kept her sheet music. The sight of the folders, each neatly labeled and sorted, steadied her. Here, she had control. Here she was the one who decided which songs were worth revisiting and which were better left in the past. She ran her fingers over the spines until she found the one she knew she would need. A collection of traditional lullabies she had performed years ago. Her hand lingered on the title, her breath catching. She had sung some of these to Miles when he was a baby. It felt like another lifetime, a softer, more hopeful version of herself she wasn't sure she could reclaim. But she knew, as surely as she knew the shape of each note in her throat, that this was the song she had to sing. She carried the music to her piano and sat for a long moment, letting her hands rest on the keys. The familiar coolness beneath her fingertips reminded her of all the nights she'd practiced until her body ached, chasing a perfection she never believed she deserved. Julian had always said her voice was the one thing he could never buy or command, no matter how many gifts he tried to offer. She had once thought that meant he respected her. It took her years to understand that what he respected was the idea of her, not the reality of the woman who refused to be owned. When she finally began to play, the first chords were hesitant, her voice raw with old hurt. But with each repetition, she felt the strength returning, the steadiness she had earned through solitude and sacrifice. She sang until her neighbors would have been justified in complaining. She sang until her throat felt tender and her chest loosened. And when she was done, she rested her hands on her knees, breathless and lighter than she had felt in months. The next morning, Elena stood in her small bathroom, studying her reflection as if she were facing a stranger. She smoothed her hair back and applied makeup with a care she hadn't bothered with in years. She didn't want to look as though she was trying to impress Julian, but she refused to walk into that party appearing diminished or defeated. She chose a simple navy dress that flattered her figure without drawing unnecessary attention. A string of freshwater pearls completed the look, a gift from her grandmother, a reminder of her heritage and the resilience that had carried her this far. When she finally stepped back, she was startled by how composed she looked. "You are not the same woman who left him," she told her reflection. "And you don't owe him anything." But a quiet part of her admitted that she did want something from him. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. That she had mattered. That what they'd shared had been real. As she packed her sheet music in her worn leather satchel, Elena's phone buzzed with a message. For a heartbeat, she wondered if it was Julian. But when she checked the screen, it was only Clara wishing her luck. She typed back a simple thank you and set the phone aside. She didn't trust herself to say more. Meanwhile, across the city, Julian was pacing his study, fighting the urge to call and demand confirmation that she was coming. He had never been able to abide uncertainty. Even as a boy, he had needed to know exactly what to expect, exactly how to plan for every contingency. It was a trait that had served him well in business and poorly in love. He stopped by the window, watching the gray clouds bunch low over the skyline. The thought that Elena might refuse him ignited a low fury in his chest. But beneath that, there was something more dangerous. A flicker of hope. That she would come. That she would see what he had built and regret ever leaving. Lauren knocked lightly before stepping into the study. "The guest list is finalized," she said, her voice measured. "Press arrangements have been handled." Julian turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "And the special guest?" "She confirmed receipt of the invitation," Lauren said. "No formal reply, but she knows the details." Julian nodded once, dismissing her. As the door clicked shut, he exhaled. He should have felt triumphant, but instead he felt the edges of control slipping. Elena had always had that effect on him, upending his plans simply by existing. He closed his eyes and pressed his palms against the cool glass, wishing he could will himself into feeling nothing at all. On the morning of the party, Elena rose early, unable to sleep. She brewed coffee she didn't drink and sat by the window as dawn crept across the city's rooftops. She wondered what she would say if Julian tried to talk to her, what expression she would wear when she saw him again. But no matter how many scenarios she rehearsed in her mind, none felt adequate. In the end, she decided she would let the music speak for her. It always had. When she finally locked her apartment door and stepped into the hallway, the weight in her chest had softened to something almost bearable. She had survived worse than a single night in Julian Carter's orbit. She had survived losing herself, and she had fought her way back. Whatever happened tonight, she would leave with her dignity intact. As the elevator doors closed around her, Elena allowed herself one last indulgent thought. That perhaps, when she finished her song, she would see something real flicker in Julian's eyes. Not arrogance, not regret, just truth. The penthouse seemed to shimmer with anticipation as twilight settled over the city's skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of rose and smoky lavender. Inside, the chandeliers blazed like 1,000 captured stars, their golden light spilling over linen-draped tables and towering floral arrangements. The guests arrived in a steady procession, men in tailored suits, women in sleek evening gowns, their laughter bright and brittle as crystal. Soft strains of the string quartet curled through the air, wrapping the cavernous space in an elegance that felt almost oppressive. Julian Carter stood near the entrance, greeting each arrival with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was immaculate, in a charcoal suit and silk tie, every detail calibrated to project unassailable composure. Yet under the polished exterior, something taut vibrated in him, a restlessness he could not suppress. As he exchanged pleasantries with an investor whose name he barely remembered, he found himself glancing past the man's shoulder toward the elevators, willing them to open. He had spent years mastering his impatience, disciplining himself to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity. But nothing in his life had ever demanded as much restraint as this. He thanked the investor and turned away, scanning the ballroom. Lauren caught his eye from across the room, giving him a discreet nod to signal that everything was proceeding on schedule. She was a study in quiet efficiency, moving among the guests to ensure the catering staff remained invisible and the photographers unobtrusive. For a fleeting instant, Julian envied her ability to slip into a role so seamlessly. He could not seem to do the same tonight. Every gesture felt rehearsed, every conversation a thin veil stretched over the truth. He spotted Miles near the buffet, his dark hair gleaming under the chandeliers as he examined a mountain of cupcakes with solemn concentration. Something in Julian's chest loosened. He excused himself from the cluster of guests and crossed to where his son stood. "Do you think I should try the chocolate or the vanilla first?" Miles asked gravely when he saw him. Julian rested a hand on his shoulder. "That's an important decision. I'd recommend starting with chocolate. You can never go wrong with chocolate." Miles nodded, clearly relieved. "Okay. Thanks, Dad." He selected a cupcake and held it carefully in both hands, as if afraid it might vanish. Julian watched him for a moment longer, feeling the stirrings of a tenderness he had grown adept at suppressing. Miles had inherited Elena's contemplative nature, her way of noticing things other people overlooked. Sometimes Julian wondered whether his son already sensed the shape of the rift that had formed long before he was born. "Dad," Miles said, lowering his voice to a whisper, "someone told me there will be singing later. Is that true?" Julian felt his pulse skip. "Yes," he said evenly. "There will be a special performance. Will it be the lady from the video you showed me?" He hesitated. A month earlier, in a moment of private weakness, he had shown Miles a recording of Elena singing at a charity gala. He hadn't meant to explain who she was, but Miles had pressed him with endless questions, fascinated by the woman with the voice like warm honey. "It might be," Julian admitted. Miles's eyes widened. "I hope so. She sounded like a princess." Julian tried to smile, but his throat felt tight. "Finish your cupcake," he said gently, "and stay where I can see you." He turned away before Miles could ask anything more. He needed air. He slipped through the side entrance to a narrow balcony that overlooked the city. The cold evening wind sliced through his composure, and for once, he welcomed it. It was easier to face the chill than the possibility that she might not come at all. Behind him, the party continued in a muted roar, glasses clinking, voices rising in polite laughter. He closed his eyes and told himself he didn't care if she walked through those doors or not. He had extended the invitation because it was strategic, because it would show everyone, and perhaps himself, that he could command even the woman who had once refused him. That was all. But when he opened his eyes, he knew it was a lie. He was about to retreat inside when the low chime of the elevators reached him, soft but unmistakable. He didn't move immediately. For a long moment, he remained motionless in the shadows, gathering himself as though preparing for battle. Only when he heard Lauren's practiced voice greeting someone did he step back into the ballroom. And there she was. Elena Rivera stood just beyond the threshold, her satchel tucked neatly against her side, her posture so composed it bordered on regal. She wore a navy dress that skimmed her figure with quiet elegance, her hair swept up to reveal the graceful line of her neck. She looked exactly as he remembered, and nothing like he remembered all at once. Older, perhaps, but stronger too, as if the years had burnished her instead of diminishing her. For a heartbeat, the noise of the party receded. He saw only her, standing under the chandelier with her chin lifted and her dark eyes scanning the room. She did not look afraid. She looked ready. Lauren stepped aside and Elena's gaze shifted, landing on him. The contact was electric. A current that snapped through him with humiliating ease. He tried to summon the cool detachment he had rehearsed, the expression that said he was unbothered, in control. But her eyes, steady, unflinching, made it impossible. She inclined her head in a small, dignified acknowledgement. No smile, no softness. Just a recognition that he existed, nothing more. It was more devastating than any open rejection could have been. He forced himself to move, to close the distance between them with measured steps. As he approached, he became aware of how many eyes were watching, some curious, others speculative. It occurred to him that perhaps this was exactly what she wanted, to show him she could walk into his world again without trembling. "Elena," he said when he reached her. Her name felt raw in his mouth. "Julian." Her voice was the same, low and melodic, threaded with a composure that made his chest ache. "Thank you for coming." She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words for hidden meaning. "I wasn't sure I would," she said, "but it seemed appropriate." "Appropriate? To accept your invitation," she said evenly. "To see for myself what you've built." His jaw tightened. "And, what do you think?" Her gaze flicked over the crowd, the glittering decorations, the towering cake. "It's impressive," she said finally. "You've always been good at creating spectacle." He ignored the sting of her understatement. "Would you like something to drink?" "No." She shifted her satchel on her shoulder. "I'd prefer to know when I'll be expected to perform." He studied her face, searching for any crack in her poise. "I thought perhaps you'd like to enjoy the party first." "I'm not here for the party," she said softly. "I'm here because you asked me to sing." He almost laughed at the absurdity of it, that after all these years they could still reduce each other to blunt truths. "I'll let you know when it's time," he said at last. She inclined her head again, then stepped past him without waiting for permission. He watched her walk across the room, watched the way people's gazes tracked her progress. He felt a surge of something he couldn't name, something that was equal parts pride and regret. Miles came bounding up to him then, crumbs smudged on his chin. "Dad, is that her?" Julian's throat felt tight. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's her." "She's beautiful," Miles said, matter of fact, as if commenting on the weather. Julian looked across the room at the woman who had once been everything he wanted and everything he couldn't hold. "Yes," he whispered. "She is." For a moment he let himself watch her without defense. The way she greeted the musicians with quiet courtesy, the way she held herself as though she knew exactly who she was. No shame, no apology. And for the first time in years, Julian Carter wondered if he had made a mistake that no amount of success could ever truly erase. Elena found a quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows, grateful for a moment's reprieve from the watchful eyes that seemed to follow her every step. The skyline beyond the glass was breathtaking, but she barely noticed it. Her reflection hovered faintly against the city lights, a composed woman in a navy dress who looked nothing like the younger version of herself, who had once walked through this penthouse believing she belonged here. She tightened her grip on the strap of her satchel, grounding herself in the familiar weight of it. This was not her world anymore, and she would not let it claim any part of her she hadn't already surrendered long ago. Behind her, the party was in full swing. A soft murmur of polite conversation rose and fell, punctuated by the occasional trill of laughter. She could feel Julian's presence somewhere among the clusters of guests, a low, steady pressure she couldn't seem to shake. She knew he was watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. He always had been a man who believed his gaze alone could bend reality to his will. But if he thought she would be unnerved by it now, he was mistaken. She was no longer the woman who had once loved him enough to let her own ambitions be eclipsed by his. She had learned that love without respect was nothing more than an illusion. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and she declined with a small shake of her head. Her mouth was too dry to swallow anything but the truth she'd carried here like a secret. She was here to sing one song, nothing more. When it was over, she would walk away and leave Julian to his empire of glass and polished lies. "Elena," she turned, already knowing who she would find. Lauren stood at her shoulder, a smile so perfectly polite it bordered on predatory. In her hand, she held a sleek tablet, the blue glow of the screen illuminating her sharp cheekbones. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Lauren said, her tone smooth. I wanted to confirm a few details before your performance. Of course, Elena replied. She kept her voice steady, though she suspected Lauren was looking for any sign of hesitation she could exploit. We'll be inviting everyone to gather by the grand piano at 9, Lauren said. Mr. Carter prefers that you perform then, before the cake is served. A part of Elena wanted to ask why he preferred that timing, but she already knew the answer. He wanted her voice to be the climax of the evening, the final flourish that would cement his control over the narrative. He wanted every person here to witness that even after all these years, she would still come when he called. Understood, she said. Lauren hesitated, her gaze flicking to Elena's satchel. May I ask which piece you'll be performing? Elena met her eyes evenly. I haven't decided. The other woman's smile faltered for just an instant before it returned, sharper this time. I see. Well, Mr. Carter will expect something appropriate. I'm sure he will. Elena lifted her chin, but he's not the one I'll be singing for. With that, she turned away, satisfied to see Lauren's expression harden. She did not owe any of them explanations. Whatever power Julian thought he held over her ended the moment she stepped onto that stage. Her song would not be for him. She drifted toward the piano, running her fingers lightly over the polished surface. It was a magnificent instrument, a Steinway grand she recognized from the countless nights she'd spent here rehearsing in the dark, long after the guests had gone home. Back then, she had believed her voice and his ambition could somehow coexist. But she knew better now. Some men didn't want partners, they wanted mirrors. She settled onto the bench, testing a few quiet chords. The familiar resonance calmed her, reminding her that no matter how far she'd drifted from the girl she'd once been, music had never abandoned her. It had remained steady, waiting patiently for her to remember her own worth. Behind her, she heard footsteps approach. She did not look up, but she felt the air shift as Julian came to stand beside the piano. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they had never said. I hope you're comfortable, he said finally, his voice pitched low so the guests wouldn't overhear. I'm fine, she replied without turning her head. You look. He paused, as though searching for a word that wouldn't betray him. You look well. She pressed her fingers against the keys, holding down a single note until the vibration settled in her bones. And you look exactly the same. A humorless smile ghosted across his mouth. I suppose that's not a compliment. It's not an insult either, she said. It's just the truth. He exhaled slowly. Will you tell me which song you've chosen? No. His jaw tightened. You're determined to be difficult. No, she said again, this time more gently. I'm determined to be honest. He studied her profile, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might say something real, something unvarnished by pride or strategy. But then the mask slipped back into place. Very well, he said. 9 o'clock. He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with the effort it cost him not to look back. She watched his retreating figure with a complicated ache she couldn't quite name. She didn't hate him, not exactly. What she felt was closer to sorrow for the man he might have been if he hadn't been so afraid of being ordinary. As she returned to the window to collect her thoughts, she noticed a young boy watching her from across the room. It took her only a moment to recognize Miles. He stood half-hidden behind a towering arrangement of lilies, his eyes wide with curiosity. When their gazes met, he ducked his head as if embarrassed to be caught staring. She felt something in her chest soften. Without thinking, she crossed the room and crouched so she was eye level with him. Hello, she said, offering a small smile. You must be Miles. He nodded, clutching a small toy car in his hands. I've seen videos of you singing. Have you? He peeked up at her through his lashes. You sound like a story. Her breath caught. That's a very nice thing to say. Are you going to sing tonight? Yes, she whispered. Just one song. His gaze brightened. Will it be the lullaby? The one from the video? For a moment she couldn't find her voice. She had nearly chosen a different piece, something bold and defiant. But looking at Miles, she knew there was only ever going to be one song. The lullaby she had sung for him as a baby. The one Julian had recorded without her knowledge, as if he knew even then that he would want to hold on to that memory when everything else had slipped away. Yes, she said at last, I think it will. He smiled shyly, and she felt a fierce rush of protectiveness for this small boy who didn't yet understand the ways his father's choices would shape him. Before she could say anything more, Lauren's voice rose over the crowd, calling Miles back to the table where the other children were gathering. "It was nice to meet you," she told him. "You too," he said, and then he was gone. Elena straightened slowly, feeling a little steadier than before. Whatever else tonight might bring, she would not regret coming. If nothing else, she could give Miles something honest, a moment of music untainted by his father's ambitions. She glanced at the clock. 45 minutes until she would stand before this crowd and bare her heart in the only way she knew how. She let herself imagine, just for a second, that Julian would hear her song and understand it wasn't an apology or a plea. It was a declaration that she had survived him, and that she was no longer afraid to let him see it. She drew in a slow breath, feeling the old fear recede. When she finally turned away from the window, she did so with her head high and her heart unguarded. At precisely 9 o'clock, the soft chime of a crystal bell called the guests to gather near the grand piano. Conversations hushed as if an invisible curtain had fallen over the sprawling room. A hush of expectation rippled through the space, followed by the creak of chairs and the shuffle of evening gowns across the polished marble floor. For one suspended instant, Elena felt the weight of every gaze turned to her, some curious, others skeptical, and a few quietly resentful that an entire event had been designed to culminate in the appearance of a woman no longer counted among their ranks. She drew in a measured breath and reminded herself that none of these people mattered. Not their judgments, not their half-smiles and sidelong glances. She closed her eyes briefly and felt the familiar steadiness return to her spine, the same quiet certainty that had carried her through countless recitals long before she'd ever met Julian Carter. When she opened her eyes, Julian was standing near the far side of the piano. His expression was composed, so carefully neutral that she could almost believe he felt nothing. But she knew him too well to be fooled by the surface. The set of his jaw, the way his thumb brushed over the cufflink at his wrist, the restless flick of his gaze toward her. It all betrayed the tension he was trying to contain. She stepped forward, her heels silent on the thick carpet. As she reached the piano bench, she set her satchel down and glanced up to find Miles standing at the front of the crowd, his small hands clasped in front of him. He looked at her with the kind of earnest expectation only a child could possess. In that moment, she knew she would sing for him and for herself, but never for Julian. A microphone had been placed discreetly at the edge of the piano. She ignored it. She didn't need amplification. The room's acoustics would carry her voice easily. She took her place on the bench, letting her fingers rest lightly on the keys. The hush deepened until it was nearly reverent, and then she began. The first notes rose soft and low, the melody unfolding like a secret between old friends. It was a lullaby she had learned from her grandmother, a psalm older than any of the towering buildings that glimmered outside the penthouse windows. The lyrics spoke of loss and hope, and the promise that even the most broken hearts could find their way home. Her voice was steady but unadorned, as if she had stripped every embellishment away so only the truth remained. It was not the performance Julian had imagined. He had expected something polished, something that would showcase her undeniable talent in a way that made it clear he had been right to bring her here. But this was different. This was raw and unguarded, a quiet act of reclamation no one could twist into spectacle. As she sang, she did not look at Julian. Instead, she let her gaze drift across the guests. She saw how some of them shifted in their seats, their polite masks slipping as the song pulled at something deeper than they cared to admit. She saw Lauren standing by the doorway, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest, her mouth pressed into a thin line. For the first time all evening, Lauren looked unsure. Miles stood perfectly still, his eyes huge, his lips moving silently as if he were trying to memorize every word. When she reached the chorus, she let her voice swell just enough to fill the space between them. For a fleeting instant, she could almost believe she was singing only to the little boy who deserved to know that music could be something pure, something that belonged to no one but himself. She did not falter. Not when she glimpsed Julian's hand curl into a fist at his side, not when the ache in her chest threatened to rise and drown her. This was her moment, her truth. No amount of regret or longing could unmake it. The final note faded into silence, so complete it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. She rested her hands on her knees and lifted her gaze. She met Miles's eyes first, offering him a small, steady smile. Then at last, she looked at Julian. He was watching her with an expression she could not decipher, some fractured combination of awe and pain and a vulnerability she had never seen in him, not even in the early days when they still believed they could save each other. For one heartbeat, she let herself wonder if he understood what the song had cost her and what it had given her in return. But she did not look away. She had nothing left to hide. The applause started hesitantly, a few scattered claps from the corners of the room. Then it grew, building into something thunderous that reverberated through the cavernous space. She accepted it without bowing, without any sign of triumph. This was not a victory. It was simply the truth, made visible. Julian took a step toward her as if he meant to speak, but she turned to Miles instead. She knelt so they were eye level. "Did you like it?" she asked softly. He nodded, wide-eyed. "It was beautiful." Her throat tightened. "I'm glad." "Was that the song you used to sing to me?" he whispered, as if afraid to say it too loud. "Yes," she breathed. "It was." He reached out and touched her hand, that small and warm and heartbreakingly trusting. "Will you sing it again sometime?" She swallowed against the ache in her chest. "Maybe," she said, "if you ever need it." He nodded solemnly, as if this were a promise he could tuck away like a secret. When she rose, Julian was standing only a few feet away. The applause was already fading, replaced by the low murmur of conversations resuming. But in the space between them, there was only silence. "Elena," he began, his voice low and rough. She lifted a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said gently. "Not tonight." He stared at her as if searching for the version of her he remembered. But she had shed that skin long ago, and she would not wear it again, no matter how he looked at her. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said after a moment. "I know," she replied. "I only wanted—" "I know," she said again, softer this time. "But some things can't be undone." She picked up her satchel and turned toward the elevators. She did not look back as she walked away. The crowd parted for her in a hush of satin and whispers. She felt none of it. The only thing she carried with her was the memory of Miles's small hand on hers, and the knowledge that she had finally sung the song on her own terms. Behind her, Julian stood motionless, his hands at his sides, his expression lost. For the first time in his life, no amount of power or wealth could compel the outcome he wanted. And though he could not yet name it, he understood that this was what real surrender felt like. As the elevator doors closed, Elena drew a slow, steady breath. Her heart was pounding, but it was not with fear. It was something closer to relief. She had come here to prove something, to Julian, to herself, maybe even to the ghosts of the girl she had once been. And she had. When the elevator began its descent, she allowed herself a single, quiet smile. The song still echoed in her chest, resonant and whole. For the first time in a long while, she felt certain she would be all right. The applause had hardly died away when the first camera flashes began to spark across the ballroom, bright pinpricks of light that turned faces into masks and moments into commodities. Elena had barely reached the back corner of the room when she felt the subtle shift, the sudden, collective sharpening of curiosity that always came before a scandal broke the surface. A low ripple of conversation moved through the crowd, and she instinctively knew her performance was no longer the center of attention. She turned just in time to see Lauren standing near the main entrance, her tablet raised like a talisman, her expression poised in that careful balance between concern and calculation. A tall man in a gray suit appeared beside her, speaking quickly, his phone held out as if to prove something urgent. For an instant, their eyes met across the space, and Elena felt a cold flicker of recognition. She had seen that look before, on publicists trying to spin a crisis, on reporters scenting blood. Julian emerged from the circle of onlookers, his face composed but pale beneath the perfect lines of his suit. Even from a distance, she could see the faint tremor in his hand as he reached to take the phone from the man. A silence settled over the nearest guests, an almost gleeful anticipation that sent heat crawling up her throat. She had thought, foolishly, that whatever storm Julian had conjured by inviting her here would be contained to the two of them. But she had underestimated just how many others were invested in the story of their past. Julian glanced at the phone screen and froze. The blood drained from his face so completely that, for a moment, he looked like a wax figure of himself, all artifice with no humanity left beneath. Then he lifted his gaze, and she saw something she had never witnessed in all the years she'd known him. Pure, unguarded panic. Lauren said something Elena couldn't hear, her mouth moving too quickly, her hands gesturing in tight, controlled arcs. Whatever explanation she was offering, it was clearly not enough. Julian shook his head once, sharply, and turned to face the assembled guests. The movement seemed to break whatever thin membrane of restraint still held the crowd in check. Questions erupted all at once, a messy chorus of voices rising over the soft strains of the string quartet, which played on in a vain attempt to preserve decorum. Elena's stomach twisted. She wanted to step back, to melt into the wallpaper and vanish, but she knew it was too late. This was not her scandal to control or escape. She had become the unwilling centerpiece in someone else's spectacle. Julian raised a hand, and the clamor subsided into tense, expectant quiet. When he spoke, his voice carried the hard edge she remembered, the steel that had built empires and buried competitors. "It appears," he began, each syllable clipped and precise, "that some individuals have chosen to exploit tonight's gathering for personal gain." He did not look at her as he said it, but she felt the weight of implication brush against her skin all the same. The old reflex to defend herself surged up, and she tamped it down with effort. She would not be baited. She would not play a part in this performance. Lauren cleared her throat delicately and stepped forward. "We have reason to believe that a member of the press was given access to internal information regarding tonight's guest list and—" "Enough," Julian said, the single word cold as a slap. "I will address this privately." Lauren's mouth snapped shut, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to triumph. Elena watched the exchange with growing unease. Whatever had transpired between them, it was clear Lauren was not merely the efficient gatekeeper she pretended to be. She was a player in this game, and she had just revealed her hand. The man in the gray suit retreated, but not before glancing at Elena with a speculative interest that made her skin prickle. She recognized that look too, the calculation of someone already composing a headline. Julian turned toward her then, and for a moment, everything else receded. His expression was stripped of pretense, raw and stricken, in a way that made her breath catch. "Did you know?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched so only she could hear. "Know what?" she whispered back. He swallowed, his jaw working. "That Lauren sold the story of your return to the press, that she arranged for them to be here tonight." Her lips parted in shock. "No," she said, because it was the only word she could find. "I didn't know." Something in his shoulders sagged, as if he had been holding himself rigid for so long that the confession had finally cracked him open. "I believe you," he said after a beat, so softly she almost didn't hear it. It was absurd, she thought distantly, that after everything, after betrayal and silence and the years that had scabbed over old wounds, he could still surprise her. Lauren stepped closer, her expression smoothed back into polite concern. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we should." He cut her off without turning his head. "Leave us." Her mouth tightened, but she obeyed, retreating into the crowd. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena felt the awareness of the watching guests pressing in on all sides, but she refused to look away from him. "You invited me here to prove something," she said finally, her voice low. "To yourself, to everyone. But you never asked whether I wanted any of this." He closed his eyes briefly, as if her words had struck some hidden nerve. "You're right." Her throat ached, but she made herself go on. "Whatever you thought you'd accomplish tonight, this isn't it. This isn't closure." "I know." His gaze flicked toward the windows, where the city sprawled in glittering indifference. "I thought if I could control how you came back into my life, it would hurt less." She let out a quiet, incredulous laugh. "It doesn't work that way." "No," he agreed, his voice rough. "It never did." The guests were beginning to drift away now, sensing that the spectacle had reached its end. A few lingered near the door, their curiosities still unsated, but most were eager to pretend they had never been party to the humiliation unfolding in real time. Miles appeared at Julian's side, his small hand tugging at the sleeve of his jacket. "Dad?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Julian looked down, his expression softening in a way that made Elena's heart twist. "It's all right, buddy. Is Miss Elena in trouble?" "No," Julian said immediately. "She's not." Miles looked at her then, his eyes wide and solemn. "Are you mad at my dad?" Elena felt something splinter and give way in her chest. She crouched so they were eye to eye. "No," she said gently. "I'm not mad at anyone. Will you still sing for me again someday?" She swallowed hard. "If you ever need me to," she promised. Miles nodded, satisfied, and slipped his hand back into his father's. When she rose, Julian was watching her with an expression she could not name. Not regret exactly, and not longing. Something quieter. Something almost like surrender. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She held his gaze. "I know," she said, "but that doesn't change anything." "No," he murmured, "it doesn't." For the first time in their long, tangled history, there was no pretense between them. No blame to trade, no unspoken debts, only the hollow ache of everything they had never been able to salvage. She stepped back, her hands loose at her sides. "Goodbye, Julian." "Goodbye, Elena." She turned away before she could second-guess herself. As she walked toward the elevator, she felt a strange, bittersweet clarity settle in her chest. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't defeat. It was something closer to peace. And as the doors slid shut behind her, she knew she had finally reclaimed the only thing that had ever truly mattered, her own story. Julian didn't move for a long time after the elevator doors closed behind her. He stood there in the center of the ballroom as if rooted to the marble floor, the muted sounds of departing guests swirling around him like the aftermath of some beautiful disaster. The glittering decorations he'd so meticulously approved now looked gaudy and absurd, a hollow spectacle that had failed to hide the truth from anyone, not least of all himself. Lauren had vanished into the background. Whether out of self-preservation or a final show of deference, he couldn't say. It didn't matter. The damage was already done. He'd invited the woman he could never forget back into his life because he'd convinced himself he could control the terms. He'd believed that if he could frame the encounter, if he could be the one to summon her, it would somehow protect him from the sharp edges of the past. But Elena had never played by the rules he set, not even when she'd loved him, especially not then. He felt Miles's small hand tugging gently at his sleeve. When he looked down, his son's solemn face was tilted up at him, confusion and worry mingling in those dark eyes. For a moment, Julian felt the years between his own childhood and this moment collapse into nothing. He had been so determined to build a life that would be impervious to the humiliations and disappointments that had shaped him as a boy. Yet here he was, standing exposed before everyone he'd ever tried to impress, with nothing to shield him but the uncertain love of the only person whose opinion truly mattered. "Dad," Miles said quietly, "is it my fault she's sad?" Julian's throat went tight. He knelt so they were eye level, resting his hands on Miles's narrow shoulders. "No, buddy. None of this is your fault." "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Julian said again, more firmly this time. "You did everything right." "Then why did she leave?" He hesitated, the question cutting deeper than any accusation. How could he explain that sometimes people left because staying would have meant losing themselves? That sometimes love wasn't enough to hold two people together when pride and fear had been allowed to grow like weeds between them? "She left because she needed to," he said finally, the only honest answer he could give. Miles studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then he nodded solemnly. "Will she come back?" Julian swallowed hard. "I don't know." His son seemed to accept this, though the sadness in his expression made Julian's chest ache. He reached up to brush a stray lock of hair from Miles's forehead and realized with a pang that his hand was shaking. The last of the guests were trickling out, their conversations hushed and careful as they slipped past the threshold. No one met his eyes. No one offered the usual hollow compliments or empty praise. They'd come to witness the performance of a lifetime, and instead they had seen something real, something unpolished and human. He rose slowly, his joints stiff, and glanced around the cavernous room. The staff had begun clearing plates and extinguishing candles, moving with the efficient discretion that came from years of catering to the powerful. But even they seemed to tread more softly than usual, as if aware that something irrevocable had been laid bare in this space. "Come on," Julian murmured, taking Miles's hand. "Let's go upstairs." They left the ballroom in silence, their footsteps echoing through the vast hallway. When they reached the private suite, where Miles's gifts were piled in glossy towers of expensive paper and silk ribbons, Julian almost laughed. He had spent so much time orchestrating every detail of this celebration, believing it would somehow compensate for all the ways he failed as a father. But now, looking at the glittering heap of things, he could only feel the emptiness they represented. "Can I open one?" Miles asked hopefully. "Of course," Julian said, his voice rough. "Whichever you like." Miles chose a small box wrapped in silver paper. He settled cross-legged on the floor and peeled the tape away with careful fingers. Inside was a wooden model airplane, its wings painted a bright, hopeful red. Julian sat down beside him, resting his elbows on his knees. "Will you help me build it?" Miles asked. He nodded. "I'd like that." They worked in companionable quiet, the only sounds the soft rustle of paper and the click of the small wooden pieces as they snapped into place. Julian found a strange peace in the simplicity of the task. There was no strategy here, no manipulation, just a father and a son, constructing something small and tangible together. When the plane was finished, Miles held it up and turned it this way and that, admiring their handiwork. "Do you think Miss Elena would like this?" Julian felt something in his chest tighten, then ease. "I think she would," he said. "She likes things that are built with care." Miles nodded as if this confirmed something important. "Maybe I can show her next time." Julian didn't have the heart to explain that there might not be a next time. He only ruffled his son's hair and murmured, "Maybe." After Miles was tucked into bed, Julian returned to his study and closed the door behind him. He stood in the center of the room for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond the windows. It struck him that he had spent so many years chasing the illusion of control that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be honest. With himself, with anyone. On a sudden impulse, he crossed to the antique cabinet and pulled out the old photo album, the one he had hidden behind a row of innocuous folders. He sank into the leather chair and opened it to the first page. There she was, smiling up at him from another life. He traced the outline of her face with a fingertip, feeling the ache of everything they had lost. For the first time, he allowed himself to turn the pages slowly, taking in each image without flinching. He paused when he reached the envelope tucked inside the back cover, the letter she had left for him the night she walked away. He had carried it with him across continents, through boardrooms and hotel suites, always telling himself he'd read it when he was ready. He knew, now, that he would never be ready. But he also knew that didn't matter. Some truths didn't wait for permission to be acknowledged. With hands that weren't quite steady, he unfolded the letter and began to read. "Julian, I am leaving because I have finally learned that love is not something you can barter or bury under ambition. I am leaving because I have watched you become someone I don't recognize, and I have watched myself disappear trying to keep you from feeling alone. I am leaving because if I stay, there will be nothing left of me to love at all. I will always be grateful for the moments when we were honest with each other, even if there were too few of them. I hope, someday, you will find your way back to that version of yourself, the one who believed in something more than winning. Goodbye, Elena." He read the words twice, then a third time until they blurred into soft, indistinct shapes. When he finally set the letter down, the grief he had kept locked away for so long rose up to meet him, sharp and clean and undeniable. He did not try to fight it. He let it wash over him, let it strip away everything that wasn't real. When the tears finally came, they did not feel like defeat. They felt like absolution. Weeks passed, and in the quiet that settled over Julian's life, something unexpected took root. He stopped measuring his days by the volume of calls he returned or the number of contracts he signed. The world he had built so meticulously, so ruthlessly, had shrunk to something more fragile, something he couldn't control with a gesture or a signature. It was humbling. How quickly the old certainties had slipped through his fingers the moment Elena walked back out of his life. He found himself drifting into Miles's room more often, drawn by the innocent steadiness of his son's presence. There, amid half-assembled model planes and a scattering of picture books, Julian felt closest to something resembling peace. Sometimes they read together. Sometimes they just sat, content in the way only children and the newly humbled could be. One evening, as he settled onto the edge of Miles's bed to say goodnight, Miles looked up at him, his small face thoughtful. "Dad," he began cautiously, "will Miss Elena come sing again?" Julian's chest tightened. He knew his son wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. Miles had felt the undercurrents that night, had witnessed the rawness between them, even if he hadn't understood all the reasons why. "I don't think so," Julian said honestly. "Why not?" "Because sometimes," Julian said slowly, searching for words he'd never learned to use, "people care about each other, but they hurt each other too much to stay." Miles considered this in the solemn way only an 8-year-old could. "But you said you were sorry." "I did." "And she said she wasn't mad." "She wasn't. Then why does it feel like she's never coming back?" Julian swallowed, feeling that familiar ache rise up, sharp and undeniable. "Because saying sorry doesn't always fix everything," he admitted. "Sometimes it just means you understand why someone had to leave." Miles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the ceiling, where the glow-in-the-dark stars they'd stuck up years ago still gleamed faintly. "I miss her," he whispered. "I know," Julian murmured, brushing a hand over his hair. "Me too." It was the closest he'd come to telling the truth out loud, and somehow, saying it made the hollow place inside him feel a little less vast. After he kissed Miles goodnight and closed the door, he walked down the dark hallway to his study, where the photo album still sat on his desk. He didn't open it again. He didn't need to. The images were etched into him now, part of the fabric of who he'd been and who he would have to learn to stop being. The following morning brought a soft, persistent rain that turned the city into a watercolor of blurred headlights and slick sidewalks. Julian stood by the window with a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, watching the droplets race down the glass. He wondered if Elena was awake yet, if she was sitting by her own window, looking out at the same rain. He wondered if she felt any trace of the ache that had settled into his bones, or if she had already laid it to rest. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. For a foolish heartbeat, he thought it might be her. But when he picked it up, he saw it was an email from the board of directors, a tidy bullet point list of the next quarter's strategic goals. He set it aside without reading. The urgency that used to drive him felt distant now, irrelevant. What did it matter if the company posted another record profit, if he couldn't name a single person he trusted? He thought of Lauren, her crisp smile and watchful eyes, the way she'd maneuvered around him for years without his noticing. She had resigned 2 days after the party, her farewell email brief and impeccably polite. He hadn't bothered to reply. Whatever she'd been hoping to gain by orchestrating that night's spectacle, she'd failed to account for one truth. Some defeats could not be spun into victories, no matter how artfully they were packaged. That afternoon, he gathered the courage to do something he'd been putting off. He called the number he'd never deleted from his phone, listening to it ring with a tightness in his throat that refused to ease. When the line connected and a familiar voice answered, his heart gave a single painful lurch. "Elena," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. There was a brief pause and then gently, "Julian." He closed his eyes, the sound of her voice both balm and blade. "I'm not calling to ask you to come back," he began. I needed to say thank you." "For what?" she asked quietly. "For coming that night," he said. "For singing. For reminding me who you are and who I was." Another pause. He thought he heard her exhale. "You don't owe me thanks," she said. "I think I do," he insisted. "I built everything in my life on the idea that if I could control enough, win enough, I'd never have to feel powerless again. But you?" His voice broke, and he swallowed hard. "You were the only person I couldn't ever bend to fit into that plan, and I spent years resenting you for it." He waited, afraid he'd said too much or not enough. But when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I never wanted you to feel powerless, Julian," she said. "I just wanted you to be honest." "I know," he whispered. They sat in silence, the rain a steady percussion against their separate windows. "I won't call again," he said after a while. "I don't want to make this harder." "I appreciate that," she said. There was a faint sadness in her tone, but also something like relief. "Take care of yourself, Elena." "You too," she murmured. He ended the call and set the phone face down on the counter. He stood there, breathing slowly, feeling the quiet settle over him like an unfamiliar companion. That evening, he picked Miles up from school himself, ignoring the curious glances from other parents who were used to seeing the nanny. Miles's face lit up when he spotted him waiting by the front gate. "Did you finish work early?" Miles asked as they walked to the car. "Sort of," Julian said, smiling. "I thought maybe we could get dinner together. Just us?" Miles grinned. "Can we get burgers?" "Whatever you want." As they sat in a booth by the window of a little diner that smelled of fry oil and coffee, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The simple contentment of being exactly where he was, with no pretense and no agenda. Miles chattered about school and the model airplanes they would build over the weekend, and Julian listened, really listened, to every word. When they returned home, he tucked Miles into bed and lingered by the door, watching the rise and fall of his son's breathing. He thought of the man he had been, so sure that nothing mattered more than being powerful, being untouchable. But the truth was simpler, humbler, and more enduring. The only thing that mattered was this, that the boy in that bed felt safe and loved, and that Julian had finally stopped trying to earn his worth in ways that left him empty. In the weeks that followed, he made quiet changes. He scaled back his travel. He delegated decisions that once felt too important to trust to anyone else. He even started attending the Saturday morning music classes at Miles's school, sitting in the back with the other parents as the children learned simple songs. And though Elena never came again, he carried her voice with him everywhere. In the lullabies he hummed absently when Miles was drifting to sleep, in the stillness of the mornings when he looked out at the rain and knew he had been irrevocably changed. It wasn't a grand redemption or a dramatic reconciliation. It was something smaller and more honest, the beginning of a life he could live without shame, without illusion. And for Julian Carter, that was enough. At its core, this story is about the dangerous illusion that success can heal old wounds or replace the love we lost. Julian believed that wealth and power could shield him from regret, that if he built an empire impressive enough, he would never again feel the ache of abandonment. But no amount of control can erase the damage caused by pride and fear. Elena's return forced him to confront a truth many of us avoid. Relationships built on domination or avoidance are destined to fracture. You can't truly love someone if you refuse to see them as an equal. And you can't demand that a person stay when your actions have pushed them away. Yet this isn't only a story of loss. It's also about humility, accountability, and the quiet grace of letting go. In the end, Julian didn't win Elena back, but he learned how to be honest with himself and present for his son in a way he never had before. He discovered that real worth isn't measured in accolades or admiration. It's measured in the courage to face your mistakes and the willingness to change. Perhaps the most valuable lesson here is that closure doesn't always come packaged in reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply the moment you stop pretending, the moment you allow yourself to feel sorrow without turning it into bitterness. Only then can you begin again, lighter and truer than before. Where are you from? Thank you for spending time with this story. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Leave a comment to share your city or country, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can be part of our community and hear more powerful stories like this one.